reality is too boring and terrifying for us to embrace, and myth is too alluring and dangerous to guide us.
Hey, welcome to Unlatched Mind. My guest today is Dr. Jeremy Sherman. Dr. Sherman is he's a self-proclaimed psycho-proctologist. I'll let that sink in for a sec. It's hard to really characterize Dr. Sherman's work. It's really deep. It'd be a massive understatement to say he's a big thinker. And you'll kind of get what I mean once we dig in here. But his blog that served as kind of the backdrop of the conversation was titled "The Inescapable Iffiness of Life." It was, really discussed life's determinism. Is this whole thing deterministic? Do we have free will? We talk about God as a designer of this whole thing. Is that possible? What are there contradictions there? We talk about quantum mechanics, particles. Could this intelligent being predict the future? We went all over the place. We also dug into the balance between kind of our desire for free will and freedom, and how that kind of clashes with our need for determinism and safety. So basically, buckle up. This one gets pretty deep. Though I think we sprinkled in a good amount of corny jokes throughout to keep it from. I don't think it got too stuffy. But no, it was good stuff. It's a great conversation. So I gave you Dr. Sherman. Jeremy, I really appreciate your time here. So let's just jump in and see where this goes.
Sounds good.
I read through a bunch of your work, and usually I can tell in a matter of seconds when I'm start reading a blog. I said, "Oh, this is the one." So your blog, the inescapable iffiness of life. I figured Excellent. We'll chat about the determinism of life and a light topic on it for Saturday. So
sounds good to me. All right, I'm all in.
Yeah. So I guess. I guess before we start, just give the folks a little background on who you are. We might start there.
Yeah, I have a peculiar life, and it took me a while to settle into it. I had inherited money young, and I was also kind of a late bloomer. I didn't have my feet on the ground for a while. I wasn't wild, but I was just kind of slow waking up, and I felt enormous guilt about inheriting the money, and I ended up joining the world's largest commune at about age 20, signing a vow of poverty, giving up a big chunk of money. Coming out of that, I worked on environmental issues, co-founded a national lobbying organization on environmental issues, primarily climate change, and then did a master's in public policy. And then had something of a midlife crisis and I found some peace of mind through a combination of reading for the first time in my life with a big heart connection, novels about just the messiness of human existence, what conflicted monkeys we are, and evolutionary psychology, which its answers became stepping stones to next questions. From there, I went to systems theory and complexity theory. And then I ended up meeting and getting on my PhD committee. I had decided I was going to write a book called Nothing Personal, which was going to be kind of a cross between, it was going to be Borscht Belt Buddhist biology, that it was going to have some of the ironic humor of the culture I came from. I'm an atheist, but I was born into Jewish circumstances. Buddhism, which at the time was a theme, a kind of an aspirational system I was drawn to at the time, and evolutionary psychology. And then I decided if I'm going to write a book on that, I might as well get a PhD for it. Went to a school that allowed me to pick my PhD committee from all over. And I had met this guy who was a Harvard neuroscientist, biological anthropologist at the time, Terence Deacon. So he was on my committee, and we've been working together now 23 years since. He was at Harvard at the time. As luck would have it, he moved to Berkeley. And so now we've been able to collaborate for many years since. He had just completed a big I would argue, many would argue, important book on the evolution and nature of language, the symbolic species it was called. And he was just beginning to turn his attention to explaining how how agents and efforts em, emerge from chemistry, basically how mattering emerges from matter.
Hmm.
And that's what we've collaborated on for many years since. So for the last 23 years, I've primarily been a researcher in three areas. One is the evolution of the emergence of life, how you get effort out of chemistry, because chemistry is not making any effort, and we are organisms. All organisms are here or anywhere in the universe. So that's one. The evolution of language and how that affects the adaptive process. That life has been adapting to reality for 3.8 billion years. Now we're doing it under the influence of language, which has all sorts of consequences that um, surprisingly have not been inventoried. There are many books, much research on the origins or evolution of language, but very little that simply inventories the varieties of ways in which it changes us,
Hmm.
makes us very different from other organisms, especially in how we respond to reality. And then the third area, all of this, realizing what I was working on, it was not a declaration up front. It was just noticing where my interest had turned, what kinds of articles I wrote. The third category is I call it only half jokingly psycho-proctology. That is, I study the nature of, you could say, butthead behavior, on this premise that
Right.
in a free society, an adaptive society, you can't tell people how to live, but you still have to stop butthead behavior, or else it won't remain a free adaptive
Hmm.
society.
Right.
Which means that you have to come up with an operational as objective as possible definition of that out of bounds behavior that can't be tolerated. So my koan for it for years has been, what is a butthead, since it can't just be anyone you happen to butt heads with.
Right.
And
Right.
then an obvious question out of that is, how do you stop them without becoming one? So I think of this as cradle to grave research, from the cradle at the origins of life to our grave situation, uh, largely a product of the fact that we are a symbolic species. That is, there are peculiar advantages to it. We could, in principle, be stewards of the world, um, but there are lots of fundamentals intrinsic to language that makes it so we're unlikely to be.
Hmm.
That is, we're more likely to become, you could say, super predators, which would be another name for a butthead. A super predator of a certain kind, that is a predator that can rationalize anything using symbols. So that's kind of the span of my life.
Is that it? Just that?
Well, I do call this my middle-age spread. I've gotten very broad. I mean, I
Yeah.
wrote an article of taking apart the meaning of to believe in God last night. I'm just all over the map, and yet, to me, it's all within that framework,
Hmm.
and I love it. It's to have the freedom to research as I do, as a function of my circumstances, and to have uh, a a bottomless inbox. I just keep on coming up with new interesting angles on this stuff.
Hmm.
That's a very sweet and lucky place to be in.
No, no. I mean, your perspective is right on. I mean, yeah, I think a lot of us would love that position. And
Yeah,
I would,
yeah,
barring the ability, the inheritance thing, I think we're pretty similar. I mean, I think intellectual curiosity has no bounds. I mean, I find myself all over the place all the time, and it's just, I think I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, you can't be that way entirely in a corporation or a company. You got to be more focused to get X, Y, and Z done. But if it's research and exploration you're after, then why the hell not? Why put it on rails, right? So
right. Yeah. So in a way, it feels like most of what I do is take notes uh, on this whole ball of wax and us in it.
mm,
And some of my most satisfying time is sitting on the front porch of the universe and doing that in conversation with people, just exploring what this is.
mm,
It seems like it seems like one of the better games in town if you have discretionary time.
Right.
If you have the freedom for it, it's one of the better things to do. That's one of the things about a symbolic species, is that we can speculate extremely broadly compared to other organisms,
Hmm.
and we are rare in the universe. We can guess, and this is taking notes on what this is just it seems like the right. It's been a comfortable place to settle as where to spend my life.
Hmm. Well, well, that's a cool story. I mean, it's you could have easily become a spoiled brat, trust fund kid, and lived up the reputation that they all have, but it seems like you did the other thing and you went the opposite way, and humility, and so anyway,
Yeah, and I was certainly haunted by that. I still am to some extent, but I would say until 40, the idea of being the impotent scion did dog me. The fear that I would be that,
Hmm.
especially in the early years when I was having trouble orienting, figuring out what I was about, what I was good for.
Right,
Um,
right,
but but in recent years, I have to acknowledge my luck and then employ it
right,
for
right,
what fits priority.
exactly. So this is kind of jumping in, but you just already touched on something that I wrote down here. You kind of touched on the butthead thing, and I think one of your Psychology Today articles it was titled the butthead was phrase was in throughout the whole thing, and I don't know if that's one of the articles you were referencing just then, but you mentioned a kind of I don't know, I guess a moral boundary for quote unquote buttheads, right? You can't just create, and as you were talking, I was thinking, well, this is just kind of a moral code and laws, and they have to put in place for any society where you got to keep the buttheads sort of in line, in order. And I always ask this, and I always look at, well, a lot of the moral code and that the box that we created, at least just look at the United States, for example, as a nation, right, as a group of people, how do we, keep the buttheads in line, but also allow freedom and quote unquote free will. We had a moral code, right? It was based on the Judeo-Christian philosophy and principles. If that was not the case, what are your thoughts on how does someone base, what's the moral compass based on if there wasn't that, and I ask that as an atheist, what your thoughts there are in terms of what is that moral compass? Is it you slide into moral relativism where anyone making the rules may, you could almost ask anybody and the compass might be different. So how do you kind of give a common guidepost to a general moral core that these buttheads should adhere to, I guess?
It's a great and complicated question that I have been confused about for a while, and that's the state I want to be in. I'm actually also much more drawn to, you could say, eternal or universal dilemmas than I am to answers. I think that dilemmas are way more fundamental than principles, um, and and so ideally you would have some moral code we would all adhere to, and it would be minimal. I mean, just take a look around the world. It's obvious that there are very many ways to live that are perfectly okay. Um, just not all of them somehow by
Mm.
anybody's particular standard. Um, so how do you make as much room as possible? How do you really make freedom for diversity, but given the paradox, which is that you can't have complete diversity? It's so one way to think about this is that uh, I have what I call the liar's paradox moral litmus test, which is that if you've got a moral principle that can be uh, read as a hypocritical or a liar's paradox meaning I am lying, which is true if it's false and false if it's true.
Mm.
That is, if you have a self-negating moral principle, it's not a principle, it's a dilemma. And from my reading, everyone, especially the popular ones these days, are fundamentally, I mean, it just blatantly hypocritical. Take one like be intolerant of intolerance, or you
Mm.
shouldn't be judgmental, which is obviously a
Yeah, that's
judgment,
good.
or do not be negative. So all of those, that doesn't mean I don't take a cynical attitude toward them. I think that the paradoxes built right into them
Mm.
point us at bedrock challenges. So that is, since be intolerant of intolerance is self-negating, we are burdened with the question, when to be tolerant and when to be intolerant.
Mm.
And that one would play directly to this question of how you could come up with a universal moral system. Now, just in the last month, I've gotten myself beautifully confused over how to employ myths of universal moral standards in a ways that don't get corrupted. This was in part because I made a new friend who invited me to where she is embedded. She and her husband live within the FLDS community, Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints,
Yeah.
which is a notorious cult. So I spent 3 days with them recently. I'm going down there for Christmas too. Made great friends. I had lived, as I mentioned, on this commune, so I had a sense of I have an appetite for the kind of communalism or community-oriented nature of people, just watching how close people can get.
Yeah.
So I'm down there and I'm actually wistful because I'm seeing how beautifully they take care of each other and how well the kids are being raised and all of that. And on the other hand, I read the myths that guide this beautiful behavior. And they are not only absurd, they are dangerous. So the summary that I've come to is that reality is too boring and terrifying for us to embrace. And myth is too alluring and dangerous to guide us. So in that respect, I am very confused. The closest I can say to what interests me gets right to your question. Plato talks about the noble lie. What he meant by it may be up for interpretation, but I like the idea that we can't expect people to live realistically. I have various friends who are campaigning for a kind of a win-win where people will wake up one day and be totally realistic about their circumstances. It will just wake up out of the need for fantasy. I don't buy it. There's no precedent in world history that we could do that for lots of reasons. That is, I could give an origin story of why we would end up the kinds of creatures we are. But there is not a myth or an ideology or a philosophy or a psychological practice, if you take something like nonviolent communication. I have never met one. It's hard to imagine one that can't be exploited by egomaniacs. That is, I don't know an ideology that can't be bastardized for my indulgent purposes. So in a way, the framing for me lately has been, how do you maximally ignoble proof a noble lie? Is there a way that you could design it's going to be a gloss, it's going to be romantic, by which I mean it's motivatedly optimistic oversimplification to motivate behavior. So that would be, so you have some kind of romantic belief system that is as much as possible resistant to egomaniacal exploitation. I'm not there yet, but in a way, all I've done in this wordy response is said, yeah, it'd be nice if we had one.
Well, I think that's pretty much has to be the answer, right? I mean, because I don't know if there is one. I don't know if you could say, well, and you could argue, well, the United States is in other countries, or other countries have been very successful, at least to this point, because they did have a unifying moral code and they could point to it. And now, if there was nothing like that at the time, what would have been the difference, right? So it's interesting to see what would have been the result if there wasn't one, I'd say angle or compass to point to and say, we're doing this, that's wrong, this is good. But then on the other hand, I say sometimes, isn't there an innate, I think, something within us that just knows, and I don't know if I believe this entirely or not, but I'll just kind of just continue with it. But there's a general feeling of just killing someone. If I didn't have any concept of anyone, if I just taking another life would be wrong. Now, then the other side of me would say, well, what if I don't know, I'm hungry, I'm in the jungle, my family hasn't eaten, I want to kill someone to eat it. I don't know where that ends, but it almost, I don't know whether my thoughts are that there's a general moral code embedded in us that's separate from any religious thought or philosophy, or
So I'm somewhat skeptical about that.
Mm.
I don't think that one can engage in moral philosophy without factoring in that 4%, roughly 4% of the population, and I would argue roughly 4% of me and you, is psychopathic.
Hmm.
So, I mean, in a way, so in my efforts to narrow in on a operational definition of butthead that encompasses all buttheads and excludes all others, I face a bunch of challenges. But one of them is that I've wanted to do it ideologically neutral. I've thought it's not really what you believe, but how you strut it. It's more about your means than your ends. But increasingly, I realize I have to face this fundamental difference. There are, if you look at nature and then you overlay, if you look at organisms, mammals, let's say, and then you overlay on it symbols, language, for example. You get this question: what do you get when you add language? When you add language to emotion, what do you do? What do you get when you cross language with emotion? You get language that will justify the emotions. Most of our language, I'll argue, is designed to make us comfortable in our own skin, self-affirmed, self-confident, and I can see why. This was a question that you touched on in your notes before this conversation. Life has always been at risk. See, what I bring to this is what I'll call an originist approach. That is, I don't get to talk about effort as explaining anything until I've explained effort. I actually have a origins of life story that informs my work in the social sciences, in the human social sciences. And one of the things you get right off the bat is that once there's effort, there's at-riskness. Life has been at risk from the beginning. That is, if you're trying to achieve something, if you're trying to defy the second law of thermodynamics or use it against itself, that is, by eating food, we regenerate ourselves hopefully faster than we'll otherwise degenerate given the second law of thermodynamics. We have been at risk from the beginning. Organisms are at risk. And it's all been guesswork. That is, every organism's adaptation is a guess at what might work to fend off the risk. And then you add on top of that language, you end up with a creature that is overwhelmed by the quantity of risk. When you think about how much world a human has to face as compared to other organisms, take your dog, how many factors, considerations, what they call Umwelt, that is the sphere of things that are potentially significant, a dog deals with compared to you. It's just overwhelming what we humans have to deal with. And on top of that, the other thing that language gives us is a fluency, an extraordinary capacity to ignore, set aside, basically deflect factors. So I'm saying there's way too much world, and us in it, particularly adept at dismissing world. We have to be. And what we'll tend to dismiss is what is inconvenient to us. So that makes us a challenging organism for survival. And you listed killing to eat. Well, obviously, we've been doing that a long time, by which I mean 3.8 billion years. But what you didn't list is the ease with which one simply can declare this is war. And at that point, all moral considerations are superseded by loyalty to your cause. So one of the ways in which buttheadedness works is just the ease with which someone can declare this is war. About anything. Right. Even, I mean, we're seeing in modern times that this is, that you don't even have to be crusading for something. You just have to posture as though you're crusading for something.
Sadly,
You
but
have
yeah.
to express more zeal than your opponent, regardless of whether it's zeal for anything at all. To take an example, make America great. Again, I was talking to a Trump supporter on the airplane yesterday, and she acknowledged to me that nobody really knows which great, what the vision is not made explicit anywhere.
No, it's not.
Actually, so George Herbert Walker Bush used to talk about the vision thing.
Yep.
Well, it turns out you don't need the vision; just need the posture like you've
You
got.
just need the slogan, right?
Yeah, you need a slogan, and the broader the better. That's one of the ways
you need
in which
hats.
Smith works. And you need hats. I've recently come to sport a "Make America Great" hat with Elizabeth Warren buttons all over it. I mean, because actually there's a tendency for a crusader or a cult to think that it's the sole possessor of the goal. I mean, I bet there are supporters of that cult who think that they're the unique ones in America because they'd like things to be great in the future.
Right.
I mean, right. Okay, so you and who else?
Oh my goodness.
So I don't know where we went with that, except I don't know, where would you want to go next?
I mean, yeah, so I have no idea. No, so I mean,
it was quite a display.
I'm looking at my notes here. Yeah, so I guess we talked about the moral compass because that was sort of I would say a theme, trickled through. I think, at least in my mind, as I was reading your blog. Now, the title of it was "In the Inescapable Iffiness of Life," right? So, were you saying? Let's just take a step back. Were you saying that life is deterministic or indeterministic, and I guess why, or both?
Great question, and easy to focus in on. So it's indeterministic, and from my perspective. So though I can't make the strongest case I would want to, that for what you'd call ontological stochastics, that is, that the bedrock of reality is indeterminate. One way I would frame it is my assumption that I can't, in part because quantum mechanics is both beyond me and beyond us so far. It's not a time when we have solutions to it. But the bedrock of reality keeps pulling the rug out from under itself, is one way I'll frame that up. So there are various levels of indeterminacy, I would say, in quantum mechanics, classical physics, and chemistry. And then with life, it gets way out there, way wiggly, way uncertain. And then with language, it gets extremely uncertain. So no, I am not a determinist by any stretch. I think the free will debate it has confused itself and is basically running in circles, because it's interesting. The people who believe in determinism basically deny will, and the free will advocates assume will and argue that it's free, but almost none of that entire debate goes into understanding what will is. So this comes back to the question of what effort is. And I think of effort as something different from nothing but physical chemistry.
Now, when you say effort, I don't want to support you for a second, because you brought that up a few times.
No,
I think that's a common driver for a lot of your thinking. So what is effort for even from an organism? You mentioned it at the organism level. We said once an organism begins to show effort, what does that really mean in layman's terms?
So I'm glad you asked. It's we struggle, Terry and I, the research colleague of 23 years, struggle to find words that get at this right. But actually, Darwin basically assumes it and acknowledges he assumes it. He calls it the struggle for existence. So anything durable is not actually struggling for its own existence. It's existing as long as it endures. A table will last for centuries and all of that. We are doing something different. Now, there's work going on inside that table. That is, there's Brownian motion and all of that. But that's not work on its own behalf. It's just work that happens. So the physical chemical world is full of work. But effort is is work on one's own behalf, work for one's benefit. It's where normativity enters the universe, is once you have work on one's own behalf. And it doesn't start out as a moral issue at all. It's just an organism decreasing the likelihood of the second law of thermodynamics, entropy, increase disorder. That is, everything's falling apart. And here we are, 3.8 billion years, a long lineage of organisms that have continued to work against that second law tendency. And we're actually quite fragile, as you can tell when one of us dies. When one of us dies, all of that effort that the organism is making stops, and you see just how fast these jelly-filled bodies of ours decay. So effort for us starts with basically death prevention, preventing ourselves from degenerating. And effort starts not with conscious. So I have used the words struggle for existence, striving, trying, effort. These are all words that get at what organisms have to do. And all of them we can tend to think of as emotionally or consciously driven. They don't have to be at all. For example, the tree outside is making effort to regenerate faster than it would otherwise degenerate. And I'm doing the same damn thing right now. While you weren't looking, while I wasn't looking, I was regenerating cells just now. And I was doing it unconsciously without any emotions involved in it. So that would be my minimal definition of effort. And like I said, the question that we've been dealing with, Terry and I, and a crew of other researchers for the last 23 years, is this one that I framed up as effort is something different from nothing but physical chemistry. Nothing your body does defies the laws of physics and chemistry. So what could it possibly be? It is a reduction, from our perspective, it's a reduction in possibilities. That is, it's basically to counter the tendency towards increased disorder. You have to prevent a bunch of pathways that would otherwise yield disorder. It's actually, life is not something added to physics and chemistry. It's a further reduction, a further constraint on what happens in physical chemistry. So when I die and the effort stops, my molecular configuration is freed up to be in way more possible configurations because I've lost the constraint. When you think about effort, it's not some new source of energy. We burn the same fuel as everybody else, as everything else. We burn the same fuel that would burn down a house. An oil fire is the same stuff that I run through me. It's actually how I focus or constrain that energy. So for us, effort begins when you've got a constraint that channels energy into work that prevents the degeneration of that constraint. I am actually, from my perspective, a constraint on what happens. And to come back around to this question of determinism, it's a constraint on possibilities. One of the ways I frame this is that it's a narrowing, not an arrowing. With language, we tend to talk about things in almost simplistic Euclidean terms, that I drove from point A to point B by a line. And yes, in retrospect, you could draw a line, a deterministic looking line. But no, the way I got from point A to B was by running through a channel. That is, let's say you just take a road. I could be anywhere within the road's constraints. So it's a constraint-based approach. And as a result, you'll get all sorts of little differences that can make a difference.
Right.
So a couple inches over and I would have scratched the paint on my car.
Right.
And ended up encountering people who were different than I would have otherwise met. And that leads to this. And so no, I see that I see us as deeply non-deterministic, and part of us would really like to be deterministic.
So
I've been writing lately about robo-envy, about an appetite that there's all sorts of disdain for the coldness with which robots are taking over the world, and I want to recognize that while also countering that there's something in us that just wishes we could be a computer.
Mm.
I could reprogram myself to be whatever I
Right.
want it to be. That'd be nice. Just upgrade the software. That'd be sweet. Or upgrade the software of my annoying friend.
Yeah. Exactly. I'll turn them off sometimes. Reboot. So
No, I actually think turning them off is actually part of the social media thing.
Oh, you're right. Yeah,
yeah,
that's true.
I love people in that world because I mean, you can just say, show less of this guy.
Exactly. Unfriend, show less. Yeah, if that only exists in the real world. So just to summarize, let me see if I boil down what your definition of effort was in there. I guess it would take whether it's humans or just organisms at all different levels. The entropy and the general, I would say, trajectory of entropy is always going to be to more. Left untamed, I guess it's always going to just continue to be more and more chaotic, less organization. And I think what you had said,
mixed up and disordered,
right.
So we're actually simpler than chemistry. I'm way simpler than, let's say, a tornado. So which is why all these people who say that you just increase complexity and you get humans, no, I don't buy it at all. I think that's actually a reverse of what's going on. If you define complexity the way that most do, it's which is that it would take a lot to describe, let's say, a thunderstorm. It would take less to describe me. I have cells that are in regularized configurations, just more of the same here, more in the same there, hair follicles, for example, something like that. So yes, I have to keep on restoring an order or preventing the disorder
to actually have an organization of things, say particles, cells, whatever, that actually can do something. Otherwise, you would it be just such chaos? Nothing would. I always draw the analogy of everything, because everything in the world, right, in the known universe, is just various degrees of organization, right? If you look at a house, that's all we did was we took a bunch of trees, we cut them down, we organized the wood straight, we took a bunch of chemicals that we found, we mine all over the earth, we boil it down and we add glue, and we call that paint, right? And we just do this organization of all stuff that we encounter in the universe, and then we call it things and give it a purpose. It sounds like, in a way, what you're saying, I think the effort, when you define effort, it's almost like that's an I keep saying organization. An organism's job is fighting entropy to try to find a purpose, or because I'm having trouble also trying to this.
Yeah, no, I can hear you're right there. We don't have to define a purpose. It's not after the fact. The very first purpose would actually come about by accident. It would have to by definition. And the very first one would be something that makes it would be a configuration that makes increased entropy slightly less likely. That's all it would be.
And it
doesn't actually look like a purpose. It's not going to look like our purposes. That is, you can't think about. People will argue that the object of the game for 3.8 billion years in life's history was biological reproductive success. That is making babies. Okay, so yes, but we should remember that you can't make a baby if you've fallen apart. You actually have to be existent for a while, and it's not just existent like by durability. You actually have to persist. It's active effort, hustling, pretty much nonstop for most of life, to prevent the likeliness. I would call it. I look for a word and I can't find one, so I'm going to have to coin to unlikelify, to make less likely the increase of disorganization that doesn't work for you. Now, you'll have to notice, we have to notice, it's not just any simplification, not just any order. It's got to be order that serves some end. So I would say that effort has to be there before you've got anything fancy going on in life at all. It's not like we're busy making order and then find a use for it, find some value in it. Effort implies value, and it's got to be there from the beginning.
So what would be the value so going back, to your example, I guess you're referring to post Big Bang. Those individual organisms, the first sign of an organism, what would be its point to like? Why would that organism show effort to do anything? What is its? Is it just?
Uh,
Is it just
it,
jillions of permutations
it,
of chance and
that's about right. Yes, it's because it can. It's not. There's so this comes back to your moral question. I don't think there's anything guiding this. Obviously, it is possible in the universe for this to happen, and obviously we're looking for the situations in which life could emerge. But the way it would emerge would be, it's so plain the way I'll describe it that it's easy to to add things to it. I'm simply saying, if you got a chemical system that happened to unlikelify its own degeneration, it would be rare, and that would be the first effort. Just that. To unlikelify degeneration. All other chemical dynamics peter out. They run out of energy, they dissipate, they degenerate, they become disorganized. That's what happens.
Is that different
in our
from
universe.
adaptation?
Is which different? Is the unlikelifying of disorder or a degeneration an adaptation?
Yeah. Yes. Okay.
But so primitive. This is the thing for our work. The way Terry has gone out of this, he's been the leader in this research. I've basically been a collaborator in the design of it and all that. But what I've loved about it is that is what I'll call this originist approach, which is he doesn't start up at the higher levels. He doesn't start with DNA. You can't, or RNA replicating. That doesn't make any sense. RNA isn't about anything. RNA isn't trying to do anything. Lots of molecules copy by catalysis. And you can get systems of molecules that copy by autocatalysis. That's still not effort. He's got to find the minimal effort and how it would spontaneously have emerged. And once you've got it, then you've got a capacity for evolution, because you can't actually have evolution. The business end of evolution is the struggle for existence, which, like I say, Darwin admitted in his book that he assumed it and couldn't explain it. So the struggle for existence is the business end. There are many people who will talk almost as though evolution, natural selection, is the business end. And this would be easy to do because natural selection is based on the idea that farmers are picking and choosing the best. The farmer is the one who makes the value judgments. So by that standard, natural selection is making value judgments. Well, that's absurd. Natural selection should better have been called natural rejection. It's the stuff that degenerates. It's about the things the things whose effort are unsuccessful. It's not a positive force. It's not driving anything. The business end is this effort, which we see as minimally unlikelifying degeneration. Darwin talks about from so simple a beginning. I noticed the other day that it's actually from so wimpy a beginning that life would have just started as a slight shift in probability that made degeneration less likely than it otherwise would have been.
Well, if your head's not hurting now listening to this, you probably need to hit rewind. So
I want to say something about head hurting about this. I want to say, since I'm steeped in it for 23 years, this is just common sense to me by now. I do stuff in my sleep, but it's not difficult stuff. I would argue that easily 50% of most professions are more complicated, more intricate than this. It's not difficult, it's unfamiliar. People haven't really dealt with this question. Check this out. Who makes effort? Agents make effort. You could call them whatever you want. You can call them agents. You could call them souls, spirits, individuals, persons. I don't care what you name them. The question is, how do you explain them? That's what we're doing. And to simply assume that there are agents doesn't really work. We are obsessed with our agency and effort. That is, if there's one thing humans are thinking about, it's themselves and what they should do.
Sure.
And yet we rarely ever visit this question of what is an agent or what is effort. That's what I mean by saying this is not complicated at all. It's just unfamiliar.
It certainly is. I mean,
It's
yeah.
most people for the first. I mean, think everybody says they're an I. I am, but we rarely, if ever, often it's the first time anyone's thought about it is when I run these questions and these speculations by people. So yes, it would give me a headache, but it's mostly because it's virgin territory for most minds. We don't have to know any of this stuff. It's just interesting, and I'll argue if you do start to figure some of this out or have some hunches, they actually guide your effort in a way. They can guide it. I don't think they can guide it like the moral principles you and I would both love to have. But still, they shape how I think about effort a lot. To have an explanation for what agents and effort really are.
Well, it's also interesting how life has evolved to where we are today, where you could be successful and survive very well, and with just the tiniest bit of knowledge. If you really think about it, you don't really have to.
That's right.
You have to kind of know when to eat. When to maybe exercise a little, sleeping, basically living according to what your society's rules, working pretty hard, and and after that, you don't need to know. You don't need to know much more. It's kind of like there's safety nets everywhere. Like as complex as life is and everything you're getting at, you don't have to know any of it and still thrive at this point.
Yeah, that's a very important point. So one way to talk about it is that it's a bit overblown to say man's search for meaning. We actually aren't searching for that much meaning. We don't need that much. It's just a tiniest little bit will do it. But the other thing that this gets at is we assume life is the default and death is the exception, because we've designed a society that accommodates it. That is, we have. So I said from so wimpy a beginning, a slight tendency to make unlikely your degeneration. Evolution, the adaptations that have accumulated over the years have made us way more robust. So much so that it is easy for people to overlook that we are hustling, we are running all day long to regenerate ourselves faster than we would otherwise degenerate. We are so, and part of that is also, I would say, psychological. That is, it would not be a comforting thought for an at-risk, language-abled organism to keep in mind that they're dying.
Right.
That would tend to make us excitable.
Yeah. So in that case, life is more the exception. I think is that what you're getting at? Like death is the default.
Life is the exception, and we have to hustle to make it happen. Because so for me, life at its most fundamental is death prevention. And like you say, we've gotten really good at it.
Yeah. Well, at least for 100 years or so.
And,
at least for 100 years at a time for each of us, give or take, right? It's not.
That's right.
Really not a lot of time.
That's actually what we've done. That's right. It's not a lot of time, and not only that, it could well be an oasis of freedom from feeling at risk that has put us at way more risk. I mean, when you think about any tyrant, they are sporting the look, what they are selling, their charisma comes from looking as not at risk at all. In fact, I think we're getting experiments that show that look of eternal resilience, eternal robustness, is all you need to get a cult going. You actually don't need anything else but the look of godlike infallibility that you cannot fail. Yeah. That's all it takes. And you can get that through hubris way better than you can get that through good decision making. You just have to pray, God grant me one good reason for what I just did. And God always provides in the sense that you can always rationalize whatever you're doing or whatever you did. I meant to do that. It's not, we always can come up with a reason. And that is very attractive.
Well, and we are definitely all over the place, but this is great. So on that note, what if we found the gene one day, we turned off the gene that's the decaying gene, and life and human beings don't decay and die? First of all, is that possible? I've read a few things on it, and it's pretty freaky to start contemplating. But I guess, do you know anything about that world, and is it possible? Then how does that affect what we're talking about, if at all?
I think the framing would be one I'd have to challenge. I'd want to know a little bit more about it. But this idea that there is a gene that turns off our tendency to decay.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's much more complexity to that, but
So,
there's those that have claimed that once they
base,
find that, or that combination of genes, then you'd have the first. Yeah, I think I read something where the first person to live forever has already been born. That was their claim, and maybe it was clickbait.
So the idea that we could extend life is not far-fetched. Actually, one of our collaborators in this research has come up with an interesting angle that is now is about to be explored with CRISPR. So that's not the primary question, but I will challenge the framing. You're not turning off the tendency to degenerate. That's impossible. That's like turning off the second law of thermodynamics. Any organism, even if it could live for decades, for millennia, let's say, is doing so not through durability, but through
fighting
effort.
that decay.
It's got to make effort. So the framing you just suggested has that taste of robo envy about it. Remember that robots exist, or computers, or supercomputers, or quantum computers exist as a function of durability. We designed them for maximum durability. And yes, there are parts of our body that are like that, but no parts of our body are eternally like that. They are degenerating, and that's why we are hustling to regenerate them. So what you'd have is something that could reduce. Here's one framing of it: is that we have to regenerate our self-protection all the time. One of the two main things we have to do, given that everything's degenerating, is regenerate some stuff faster than it would otherwise degenerate. That is, self-healing, I would argue, is fundamental. It's way more fundamental than, or self-repair, you could say, way more fundamental than self-replication. You can't self-replicate if you're not repairing yourself, and you have to. But the other part is self-protection. That is, the other thing you can do is prevent the influences of second law entropy increase. So, for example, skins or barks or membranes or shells or all of those things are protections that do have to be regenerated, at least to some extent. So maybe you could have a gene that would give us better protection against degeneration, but we would still be making effort to prevent our degeneration. It's not like you can turn off the second law.
So the way I framed it was more binary, where there was just a switch that you're right. But what you're saying, yeah. So perhaps a better way to look at it is that
it would be a switch. It was switch. There are many switches that could increase our robustness.
So maybe living to 1,000 years is the next step, as opposed to because you basically shift that ratio of effort required to prevent decay, and decay is not happening nearly as fast because you found some way to adjust that ratio, and now you live to 1,000 years, not 100 years. Still very scary, by the way.
Well, yeah, it's scary and complicated and interesting and all of that. But actually, I want to come full circle, because in a way, and this is just a new idea that came out of this conversation, which is why I like sitting on the front porch of the universe with you, is what we were talking about earlier as a moral philosophy. Remember, I described it as a ignoble-proofed noble lie, or meaning a beautiful cultural narrative, let's say, for the whole wide world, that couldn't be abused by the egomaniacs like all of them are. Like all of the myths we have so far are exploitable that way. That's the equivalent of turning off the degenerative tendencies of our bodies. And it's also so this is a new insight. It would have to be a living ideology that is constantly hustling to protect against the butthead abuse of it. Do you see the parallel? Because it's kind of
no, that's interesting. Yeah.
So in a way, we're talking about doing that for the yeah, yeah, for doing that for the global
Right,
mind.
right, right.
Um, what and for that you have to remember, no, it's not a matter of turning it off. You can't make it uh, uh, abuse proofed.
Right.
You can't do that. You can make it so ignoble, meaning the opposite of noble. You can't make anything automatically and permanently and completely free from that. It would be a system like what I imagine. It's a kind of an antibody system that a culture would have that would nip butthead behavior in the bud,
Mm-hmm.
and would be vigilant, like with a rotating turret. It would be looking for it from all sides. There is a tendency for our moral philosophies to be reactive to past moral philosophies that didn't work. That is, there are countercultures, but there are also countercults. So for me, libertarianism is just an overstep in the right direction in response to the excesses of what was touted as communism and socialism. That was neither. Stalin was not a communist. He was not a socialist. He was a psychopath. Um, so that is, he was a psychopath who happened to dress it up in communism.
Put a label on it.
He would have dressed it up in whatever got him through. So then we misread it and say, yeah, communism was at fault. And we come up with another one, which psychopaths can use. Once again, they can dress up their psychopathy in the counter cult. So yes, you'd have to be vigilant from all sides and not reactive in that dumb way that so what I'm basically saying is Stalin was a butthead. And I could use more vulgar terms for it. I'm actually not particular about the terms. I'm talking about he was engaged in the behavior that is anti-adaptive. It's about not responding to reality. It's about dominating reality, pretending you can dominate it. But reality wins all debates. So you need a very adaptive moral philosophy, which is an active effort on the society's part. It wouldn't be an automatic switch.
Well, so jumping a little bit, I think, and this is probably the last topic we'll circle on, which we probably can go anywhere with this one, but Laplace's demon. I knew some of the key tenets of what you had, because you alluded to it in your article, so I dug in a little bit, and I just wanted to spend a little time on that because my head just was, it was just blowing my mind just thinking about the possibilities there. So I'll just kind of summarize my, layman kind of perspective on what this whole thing is. And like I said, I read a little bit about it this morning, but again, and you were trying to dig into life's determinism and to what degree is it, and we kind of talked about that a little bit already, but the idea would be if just as, and I think I put the simple example of a pool, a pool table with a bunch of, pool balls on the table.
Right.
If you knew the angle that they say the cue ball is coming in, or you knew the velocity that I was going to hit this pool cue, and you knew exactly all the angles in place, and you knew the mass of the balls and all the Newtonian physics involved, of what was going to happen. You could predict exactly where every single ball was going to land, come to rest, I should say, on the table. After you break apart those balls. So that simplistic analogy in my head, it's like, okay, well, yep, a computer, a intelligent being, if you will, could easily predict exactly what's going to happen. Now, you zoom out, or I should say zoom out and zoom in, I guess, in a sense. We know that the universe is made up of particles, and you can get into quarks and electrons, and but keeping it more generically, we just say particles. In the quantum world, we have waves. So if a god, if a being, if someone, a super intelligent entity had that same view that I just described, or that same knowledge that I just described of the pool cues, but at every single particle and wave in the universe, why couldn't that being, that god, know the past, present, and future? And I guess that one question. The second question would be, and how would that affect whether life is deterministic? Now, if people's heads weren't hurting yet, now is the time. Did I quantify the scenario? I mean,
yeah. You raised the Laplacian question, so you made a few assumptions there that are up for debate. Let's say in the quantum realm.
By the way, I just disclosed everything I know about quantum mechanics, so that's pretty much it. So, which was basically nothing. So
but let's set that stuff aside because head's already
Yeah.
hurt enough, and we can get at another angle at it. So, what I noticed, so I put together this dialogue called Gödel Mighty, playing with Kurt Gödel's argument and God Almighty, and so it's a I don't know if did you hear that dialogue?
Well,
It's
you mean was this?
it's
Yeah, I was pronouncing Godel, but
it's a conversation with God.
I did.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you did hear
This
it.
was so.
Yeah.
Godel was the.
So let me
was
just
that the he did the incompleteness theorem. Was that his?
Yeah. So there's that. But here's what I want to keep this at the most basic and intuitive level. Why would this supercomputer do this analysis? It would do this analysis perhaps to provide some predictive utility, or maybe to intervene. So one way or another, there's going to be interplay between it and the circumstances it's in. It's tracking. So there is going to be some interaction between it and what it is modeling with absolute precision. Once that barrier has been breached, it is now part of the equation. So this is something that they've noticed over the years about Laplace's demon is he's also got to track himself. The demon the computer has to also factor in its own computations. And at that point, you get into a strange loop relationship where it's not clear what's affecting what. It becomes, it's sort of like the three-body problem. It becomes incalculable at that point. If your tracking of a circumstance is part of the circumstance you're tracking, you're basically eating your mouth in
eating
a way.
Your own mouth. That was a great quote there. That really is perfect analogy. Yeah.
Yeah. So that stuff is. I mean, I should just say that, given my circumstances that are relatively comfortable, that stuff just tickles me pink. I mean, I am a major fan of what my dad used to call Escherisms, and my favorite from him was, "I haven't lived my life in vain for nothing." But I come up with one after another. They just tickle me. I think they're just fascinating. So this idea about the bedrock pulling the rug out from under itself, or I've said for 23 years, no matter how hard I chase the truth, it will never catch me. Remember, I was talking about you shouldn't be judgmental is a judgment. That is, all of those things are where I find wisdom. That is, I am prompted to turn my attention towards those things because I find wisdom in them. I call myself intellectually bi-curious, by which I mean nothing sexual. I just mean that when I hear myself or someone else talking out both sides of their mouth, I become ferret-like. Not because it's more moral, but because it's always been pay dirt. To look at the internal contradictions is just, for me, it's sweet. So back to your question about the determinism. Well, one thing I have to point out is that we have an appetite for determinism, and we also have a terror of it. What I think we really like as human beings would be a ratchet. That is, I'd like a deterministic ground so I don't fall through. I don't want to be free. I don't want the freedom for free fall, and I want the freedom to climb. I don't want a ceiling. I want a floor. On my own potential advancement. So to notice that ambivalence in us, and then to recognize that the real challenge that relates to the Laplace demon is that everything described in Laplace's demon is about physical cause and effect pushes and pulls, like your billiard balls. Well, I'm arguing here that if you have an explanation for how effort comes into the world, effort actually came into the world, and effort is not push and pull. A stop sign doesn't cause me to stop unless I crash into it. I stop as a product of my interpretation of it. And this is true at the most basic level. Trees and bacteria, they're interpreting. Interpreting is not cause and effect. Now, you could say that interpreting is deterministic, though that would be a hard argument to make. For example, just think of me stopping at a stop sign. So I stop. It's near my house, so I stop there often. Do I stop exactly the same way each time? No, I don't. Could those little differences make a difference? Yes, they could make a difference. Why am I stopping at it? Not because it caused me to stop. It wasn't push and pull. It's because the sign is about traffic for my safety from my perspective. So you've got everything. You've got purpose. That is, I'm trying to stay alive. You've got and once you start thinking about this radical difference between interpretive effort and cause and effect, that's another factor that this is why I said that the amount of determinism shifts as you move through these levels. Like quantum mechanics, determinism is we don't know how it works yet. Classical mechanics we know pretty well. Classical physics, life, and then symbolic life, it changes radically. And my point about the symbolic life is, if I can use the word, it's a total clusterfuck. It's a clusterfuck to be a human being. The number of factors that could give you advantage and disadvantage, the number of things you could worry about if your mind wasn't constrained, it is. I could definitely see why we want determinism our way.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's
because the indeterminacy at the human level of intention is just too much.
So in summary, there, I think your point was, I think when you were having that conversation with, I think her name was Margaret. It was Margaret's discussion with God.
Yeah,
she was asking you. I forget exactly your question, but you basically said, I think the point was that God can't intervene. He can't both control the universe and intervene within it, because his intervening within it will mess up his control, or mess up where it's going to go, because he'd have to be, I think you said, I can't keep track of me keeping track. So that's that little recursion problem.
That's right. Yeah. It's not just the Back to the Future factor. There is the Back to the Future factor. It's also that God would have to also monitor. He would have to be Laplacian about his own process.
But why couldn't he?
And at that point, you got to.
That's what. So yeah. So my I guess my pushback to that was, and this was just kind of thrown, whatever, the mud at the wall, see what sticks. I was like, well, who do we to claim we understand how God would? Why would he be constrained to the logic that we're even laying out right here? And maybe that's a cop out. Yeah. I don't know, but it seems.
No. I think it's relevant. See, I am an anti-absolutist. I am an anti-fundamentalist. And remember, I'm tickled by the irony of such things like that. And if someone says, "See what you've done there, you're being a hypocrite," I would say, "Yeah, that's right." It's even that bedrock for me pulls the rug out from under itself. So one can always do that. This is why I actually don't think I could ever come up with an objective definition of butthead behavior. It's why I don't think you could ever come up with a moral principle. Whenever you get conflict at one level within human language, let's say a debate about what the moral absolutes are, you have the potential for a higher level above it. So, for example, if I declared no matter what absolute last word I could declare about reality or logic or moral, there is nothing to prevent another level at which that becomes wrong. So my only objection to a "you don't know that for sure" response is that it's universal.
Right.
I mean, I agree that I don't know that for sure. And the fact that you pointed out doesn't actually make yours any more assured.
Right. And the fact that they said you don't know for sure means they don't know for sure that you don't know for sure. You could put it back on that, right?
Well, yeah, that's right. It goes on and on. So very fundamental to my work, I am a fallibilist, working against the human appetites for infallibility. A fallibilist is someone who this is a term from philosophy, and it means taking on board the assumption that all bets, all interpretations are guesses that could prove wrong. That doesn't mean they're equally likely to prove wrong. That's what I call the doctrine of foregone inconclusion. It's usually used as a reason. It's usually used in one of those "you don't know that for sure" ways, which is, hey, nobody knows anything, so I'm allowed to believe whatever the heck I want. No, we can make educated guesses, and they matter because reality wins all debates. We better conform to it to some extent. But for me, the mantra is, no matter how confident I am in a bet, I'm still more confident that it is a bet. No matter how confident I am in a bet, I'm still more confident that it is a bet. That's a fallibilist position.
I have a lot of Matrix type references in my head right now. It's very, very Matrixy.
Right, but notice how the Matrix is actually playing with a different version of it. What I'll call "I once was lost, but now I'm blind" syndrome. This is, you get this from Plato's cave. Obviously, this is part of what the Matrix was all built on, which is you're living a delusion, and then you come out of the delusion, and you see reality. And I'm saying, no, you live a delusion, and you come out of the delusion, and you recognize that you are deludable, which is, I think, a way healthier response than the "I once was lost, but now I'm blind." I mean, a whole lot of people have one cosmic wedgie in their life, one crisis, and come out of it both appalled by the experience, and with some new conviction by which they mean to prevent that from ever happening to them again. So that's and the Matrix just plays right into that.
Right.
As if now I see the light. No, you don't. You're still interpreting. You're still potentially deludable.
Yep.
That's what was proven here, not that you were wrong once and now you're right. It was proven that you're interpreting. And I will say that the biggest cosmic wedgie in Darwin's work is not that we descended from apes or that God has a diminished role, but it's infallibility. It's that there is no formula. That just when you get a good one, it stops working. That adaptation is an ongoing process. It's basically counter-formulaic. It's counter-recipe. It's saying there is no formula for living right. Life is guesswork. And that's terrifying. That's just terrifying.
Yeah.
Until you get comfortable with it. When you get comfortable with it, it's actually beautiful and in many ways forgiving.
Well, that's actually where I think I wanted to close this out was what Lee. We touched on a bunch of different things. Some are scary. Some are. I mean, they're all really cool, but some could be classified as scary. So when you again, as an atheist, as someone who thinks the way you do, which is obviously deeper than I would say most folks that we encounter on a day-to-day basis. I mean, maybe you're surrounded by peers, so it's a little different for you. But what is the purpose? What is the goal? What keeps you excited? And what's the general? I did think I even said some notes to you earlier about your article. Like, what do you declare life's victory to be? Like, what is a victory? Or when you're in your deathbed, I did it. What is the? I guess with general purpose. What gives you excitement? What motivates you?
You're talking about me personally.
Yeah.
No. It's in my weird, peculiar, lucky circumstances. I mean, just to know how perverse it is, I have not ever in my life worried about paying a bill. That's just bizarre. And I have to keep that in mind. This morning I coined the term psycho-proprioception. Proprioception is knowing it's alertness to where your body is at any time. I have to keep in mind how weird my life is. I have to keep in mind that where we stand depends on where we sit, and I happen to sit in this peculiar place, and I have to keep on compensating for it in ways that where I can't engage in be like me syndrome without being a privileged person who doesn't understand. Yeah. So, but setting that aside, what currency do I live for? New ideas, writing them up. It's very similar, I'm guessing, to yours in this respect. That is, I have a new idea, I write it up, I get a little response, that motivates me to have more ideas. In a way, it's always next dilemma. That is, I want to flag the question that follows from my answers. Early on in this work, I wrote that up at a time when it felt a little more poignant to me. I wrote it up as limerick because early on, a bunch of ideas came to me and there was no audience for them. So I thought that limericks were actually the easiest way to get a full thought across. And so it was this. After finding solutions that fit, I'd like to kick back and just sit on my laurels, but then a resulting dilemma proves questions in life just don't quit. So for me, the joy is just the next question and the conversations with people about it. There was a time when I was younger, I'm 63 now, when I did not feel at all on schedule with my life. At this point, I just feel like all I got left to do other than help out and be nice and take care of my kids and who are now my youngest is about to turn 30. But helping out. But other than that, training my intuitions, since it's so much easier to follow them than override them. I wouldn't trust overriding intuition much at all, but training them, I think that's what we're doing. My intuitions are biopsychosocial, that and I'm basically cultivating them and taking notes, trying to figure out how to minimize butthead behavior, but also since I have, you see, I got to say, the arc of my life has been, I was a little young for the counterculture, the hippie movement, but I jumped on board that. Like I said, I joined a hippie commune. I was about 10 years younger than most of those people. But there was a time when I thought that there were actually adults in this world and that we had a good chance of waking up the whole wide world, and that would be the age of Aquarius and all of that. Well, the overall arc is to recognize just how fundamentally impotent I am at that level. Me and everybody else. It's just terrible. I mean, because I realized the other day I have non-survivor's guilt. I'll be dead when the worst of the calamities I helped bring about come about. So there is a part of me that takes some refuge in just taking notes. If you think about it like one of these late Roman historians who's writing down what's happening during the fall. I don't know. I don't go up and down in my mojo for activism. I still do a lot of activism, and I don't want I don't want my ups and downs to be affected by my analysis. But I do recognize that if I took careful, accurate notes on what happened, what we are, the whole arc of us, and whether they're ever read again, certainly not. My name is irrelevant to whether they're ever read again, but to take careful notes, that's a beautiful object of the game of life if you can afford some time for it.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like you're not driven at all by recognition or certainly not money. You've made that, you take all that.
I was for years driven by the need for status. And it was, I would say, only 5 years ago that I realized, wait a second, status is absolutely essential if you've got to keep food on the table. But since I don't, and since I never got much, I actually prefer going out into the world pretty status naked these days. It's the content of my ideas.
Seems liberating. The first word that comes to mind is liberating. Yeah.
Totally liberated, but I get to actually think and say what I want. I get my mind back because I'm not busy trying to prove anything. And as a result, I don't have nearly the leverage of all sorts of people who, they have a bigger megaphone for getting these ideas out, their ideas out. But I also find that in general, to gain status, you have to defang your ideas a fair amount. And I'm glad to not have to do that. And for me, it's actually, I have rounded all the way down to it. I retired from sex, love, and romance about 3 years ago. And I said, I'm glad my lack of appetite finally caught up with my lack of aptitude. Because I was just too mouthy for that kind of intimacy. And I got my mind back. So now I'm really happily married to solitude and friendship. Friendship is so clean. You connect where the connecting's good. You don't come at each other with this exaggerated cookie cutter. I'm just delighted by that freedom by now.
Well, that's interesting. That's a good story, and I really appreciate that. Well, Jeremy, so thank you so much for your time. I mean, I did write a note here, and I said there's no way I can get into this on this podcast, but I said and I just wrote a note. Next episode, could we be living in a simulation? And I feel like you'll be all over that. But
yeah, we could talk about that. We could talk about that in an
next episode.
Yeah, we could talk about The shorter answer is yes and no, but mostly yes. I think that interpretation is a simulation of
Yeah,
a sort.
yeah.
But if it's the whole universe of simulation, anyway, we'll talk about it
but
sometime.
yeah, that's next on my. It's way high on my list of things to talk about. It's fascinating, but Jeremy, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. I'll be in touch.
Sounds good. All right, thank you, Vinny.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
And that's a wrap. I hope that didn't hurt your head too much. And thanks for listening. Catch you next time. See ya.